Now, strawberry ice cream happens to be one of my favorite homemade flavors. It's so delicious. Now, the ice cream starts with a basic custard, and I use the same recipe no matter what kind of ice cream I'm making. I'll start by pouring 3 cups of half and half into a saucepan, and then I'll add 2 cups of sugar. Is it any wonder homemade ice cream is so delicious? Now, I'll turn on the heat, and I'll just stir this to get the heat going. And while that warms up, I've got a vanilla bean. Vanilla bean is something I always add to homemade ice cream. It adds just amazing flavor. It is one of my go-to ingredients, and it goes right into the half and half and sugar mixture. Now, I'll just stir this until it gets really, really hot before I move on. I have 9 egg yolks, and I whisked them just for a few minutes until they were nice and light yellow. That's the perfect color. Now I'm gonna temper these egg yolks. I'll take a ladle of the hot mixture, and while I whisk the yolks, I'll just gradually drizzle it in really, really slowly. We all know what happens if we add eggs to really hot liquid, so tempering the yolks just slowly brings them up to temperature. The bowl feels warm, and that's perfect. So now I can just pour it right in without any fear. Nobody should make ice cream with fear. Now I'm just gonna slowly cook this for a few minutes. So when it's thick enough to coat the spoon, it's done. Then it just gets poured through a fine mesh strainer into a pitcher. And this is where things get even better. 3 cups of heavy cream. It just gets added to the custard and stirred in. And that's the custard all done. Now it just needs to go into the fridge for a couple of hours. Now I've got to turn this into strawberry ice cream, and I'll do that by making a strawberry puree. I've just got a good amount of whole strawberries, and I'll add a little bit of sugar, just about 2 tablespoons or so. The custard is pretty sweet, so the strawberries don't need much. Now I'll just get the lid on, let the blender go. Just pour it in and swirl it around. I love it when it looks like a pink and yellow marble. Oh gosh, it's so pretty. Now I'll let the ice cream maker do the really hard part. I'll just pour in about half of this. This maker freezes about half of this quantity at a time. But that's okay, it is totally worth the wait. Get the lid on. Now, it's just about patience. My machine takes about an hour to turn the custard into ice cream. Then it's just a matter of getting it into a freezer-safe container, covering it, and putting it into the freezer for a few hours until it's frozen. Oh, how pretty is this? I cannot wait another second. I'm gonna dig in. Do me a favor, don't tell my kids this is in the freezer. Let's just keep it between us. So good. Let me tell you about those pumpkin cinnamon rolls. They are amazing. First, I made the dough. I just put some milk in a saucepan with vegetable oil and sugar. Then I stirred it together and heated it up until it was really hot but not quite boiling. Then I removed the pan from the heat and let it cool a bit. Then I sprinkled on some active dry yeast and let it sit for about 5 minutes. Then I stirred in pumpkin puree and just let it sit. Then it was on to the dry ingredients. Now in a separate bowl, I added flour, ground cinnamon, ground nutmeg, and ground ginger. Then I stirred it all together and sprinkled it into the saucepan. When everything was all stirred together, I covered the saucepan with a towel and set it aside in a warm place to rise for about an hour. And when it was all risen, it was time to move on to stage 2. Oh, look at that dough. It is so bubbly and puffy. It pretty much doubled in size. Now I'm just gonna finish it off and add half a cup of more flour, a generous half teaspoon of baking powder, a scant half teaspoon of baking soda, and half a teaspoon of salt. And then I'll just stir this addition of the dry ingredients into this puffy dough. Without this final addition of flour, the dough would be way too sticky. So it's nice to give it a chance to rise and then finish it off with just a little more flour. Okay, I've got it pressed into a rough rectangle shape. I'll give it one more sprinkle of flour, and then I'll use the rolling pin to roll it into a nice big rectangle. Now I have a stick of melted butter, and I'll just drizzle it all over the dough. It's all covered in melted butter. So now I need to sprinkle on the sugar and spice, and boy, is it nice. It's just white sugar, brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and ground ginger all mixed together. Okay, now this just gets sprinkled all over the butter. I want to do it in a nice even coating. Okay, now I have a whole bunch of finely chopped pecans, and I'll just sprinkle those all over. Okay, so now it's just about rolling them up. I use a bit of a typewriter motion, going back and forth with my fingers, rolling the dough toward me tightly so it's nice and neat. The seam gets pinched closed, and the trick is to turn the roll over so the seam is facing down. Then it gets cut into half-inch slices, which go into buttered pans. This amount of dough makes 3 pans, 2 for Pastor Ken and 1 for my family. Then after the rolls have risen for about 20 minutes, it's time to bake them. They go into a 375-degree oven for 15 to 18 minutes. While the rolls finish baking, I'm gonna make a delicious frosting to go over the top. Now it starts with 8 ounces of cream cheese. Now along with the cream cheese, it's powdered sugar, whole milk, melted butter, a pinch of salt, and it all gets beaten together until it's nice and smooth. I always like to ice cinnamon rolls right when they come out of the oven. When they're nice and warm, they just suck up all that beautiful, beautiful icing. I'll get a big blob right in the middle of each one. Oh, that was a mighty big blob right there. It does look like a lot of icing, but as the rolls sit, it's gonna settle down into the crevices. Oh, man. Now I'll just grab some of the chopped pecans and sprinkle them all over the frosting. All right, that's 1 pan for my family, 2 for Pastor Ken. I predict he is gonna love these. For dessert, I'm making a batch of salted caramel cheesecake squares. Of course, I have to start with dessert. It's the best part. I'm starting by making the crust. It's just a regular graham cracker crust, really tasty. I put in 2 sleeves of graham crackers, and I will add some pecans to give it a nice nutty flavor. And the lid goes on, and I'll pulse it just to break them up. To moisten up the crumbs, I've got a little melted butter, and I'll pulse it while it goes in. And for extra yumminess, a little splash of vanilla. Pulse it all in. Now this goes into a buttered pan. I lined it with foil just to make it easy for the squares to come out when they're done. I like a generous crust with my cheesecake, and this is exactly that. It's gonna be nice and thick. I wanna firm it into the bottom of the pan. The crust looks great, it's all packed in there. So now I'll start on the cheesecake filling. I have 3 blocks of cream cheese. It's been softening. And I'll add 1.5 cups of sugar and let this start mixing together. This is looking great. Now I have 4 eggs that I cracked into a pitcher, and I'll drop them in one at a time just to give each egg a chance to mix in. Okay, that's looking great. Now a splash of vanilla. And the last thing, and I'll just add it while the mixer is going, 1/2 cup of sour cream. This is a fantastic cheesecake recipe. I use it all the time. I'll turn up the mixer just to get it nice and smooth for a few seconds. That looks perfect. Can't promise I'm not gonna lick the bowl. It just looks too good. Get it all smoothed out into the corners. Look at this luscious mixture. The cheesecake goes into a 350-degree oven for about 45 to 50 minutes. And after after that time, I'll turn off the oven and open the door for another 10 minutes. And after that, it goes into the fridge. All right, the cheesecake is baked and cooled. It looks amazing. And now it's time to pour on the caramel topping. I poured a can of sweetened condensed milk into a pan. This is the secret to foolproof caramel. Then added dark brown sugar, salted butter, some dark corn syrup, a little vanilla extract, and stirred the mixture until the butter had melted, the sugar had dissolved, and the whole thing had come to a boil. Then I attached a candy thermometer and boiled the caramel, stirring constantly until it reached 225 degrees. Then the heat went off. I let the sauce cool for about 5 minutes, and now I'll pour it all over the surface of the cheesecake. Oh boy, how good does this look? Now the pan goes back into the fridge, and then before I go to the building, I'll cut the cheesecake into squares and I'll sprinkle them with salt. I cannot wait for dessert. It's ice cream cake, and it's gonna really hit the spot after everybody's been hauling hay. It's got a lot of great shortcuts, so it's not hard to make at all. I started with a frozen store-bought pound cake, and I cut it into 3 slices. I put 1 slice into a loaf pan that had been lined with plastic wrap. Then I covered that slice with a cup of vanilla ice cream. I sprinkled on chopped peanut butter cups, then put on a 2nd slice of pound cake. The next layer of ice cream was chocolate, Todd's favorite. On top of that, I sprinkled some chopped chocolate candies. Then the final layer of cake goes on top, followed by a cup of chocolate chip ice cream. And for the topping, I squeezed chocolate sauce all over the top. This is the kind that hardens as soon as it hits the ice cream. Then I sprinkled on the 2 candies. I let it set for a few seconds, and then I loosely folded the plastic wrap over the cake. Then I put it into the freezer to harden, and I made a whole other cake. This cake is so simple to make, and I'll tell you how to serve it up. So you take the cake out of the freezer, lift it carefully out of the pan, peel back the plastic wrap, and voila, ice cream cake. Look at all those layers of deliciousness. This cake will make you very, very popular. Well, it's a fun day around here because my husband's 2 best friends from college are visiting, and they came into town to watch a big football game on TV. So we're having a football spread tonight, and I'm starting with the recipe that we'll probably wind up eating last, making a big batch of knock you naked brownies. I start with a German chocolate cake mix, and then to that I'm gonna add 1/3 cup of evaporated milk, and then a stick of melted butter. I'll just mix that a little bit, and then I'll chop up a bunch of pecans. A couple years ago, somebody sent me a gift of killer brownies, and they were so good that I actually rationed them. And this is the closest recipe I've found to the killer brownies that I was given. Brownies are perfect for football food because the whole thing about football food is it needs to be easy to grab and eat with your hands. So I couldn't imagine having a layered cake or something fussy. It just needs to be quick and something that the guys can just grab. And I don't know, there's something about giving old college friends a batch of knock you naked brownies that kind of cracked me up. But I'm kind of mischievous that way. You'll need about a cup of pretty finely chopped pecans. So I'll add these to the mix and just stir them up. It's a really, really thick batter. You can't pour it at all. You have to really kind of smush it with a rubber spatula to get it combined. So right now I'm just going to use half of this mixture. So what I do is I just press it into the bottom of the bowl, and then I use my spatula to draw a line right down the middle. And then I know I'm getting exactly half the dough. Math has always been my strong suit. Just stick it in this greased and floured pan, and then the easiest way to do it is just use your fingers to pat it all along the bottom. All right, now it goes in the oven 350 degrees for 8 to 10 minutes until it's done. Okay, I've got a double boiler going, and I've just unwrapped 60 caramels. I didn't eat one, I promise. I'm gonna add 1/2 cup of evaporated milk. Now I added 1/3 cup earlier, so we've almost used the whole can. And then just give it a little stir, and this will take a little while to melt. Okay, oh, the caramel's perfect. Nice and smooth. Now I'm gonna grab the brownies out of the oven. These aren't actually done, they're just set. And you're not gonna believe what I'm about to do to these. Grab the melted caramel sauce, and it just goes in a layer over the first layer of brownies. Okay, now I'll just spread it out into a layer. Now I'm gonna grab some chocolate chips and just sprinkle them on. And you really just need a single layer of chocolate chips. The brownies are gooey enough as it is. And now I'm gonna take the other half of the brownie dough. And when I use the first half, I could just use my fingers and press them into the pan, but I can't do that this time because the pan has all this stuff going on. So I'm gonna press it into a square. This all just turns into a gooey, wonderful masterpiece. Okay, now I'm gonna stick this in the oven for another 20 minutes or so, and then I'll take them out and chill them, and then cut them into pieces and serve them to the guys. Whether it's a small dinner or a big holiday gathering, you really can't go wrong with apple pie. Now this one has a crumb topping and it's drizzled with caramel sauce at the end, so it pretty much takes apple pie to a new level. Now I'm making the crust for the pie. I started with 3 cups of all-purpose flour. I used a 1.5 cup measure. They're so handy. And I'll add a teaspoon of ground cinnamon, half a teaspoon of ground nutmeg, and then a teaspoon of salt. This is the pie crust recipe that my friend Sylvia shared with me years and years ago. I added the spices just to give the apple pie a little bit of an edge. I got all that stirred around. Now I'll add 3/4 cup of cold shortening. I just cut it into squares. And then the same amount of cold butter. Now I'll just use a pastry cutter to slowly combine the dry ingredients with the shortening and butter. I got most of the big chunks of shortening and butter broken up. So now I'll add a beaten egg. I didn't overbeat it, I just barely stirred it around with a fork. Now I have a little container of ice water, and I'll just add about 5 tablespoons right over the top. Whenever you're making pie crust, it's important for the ingredients to stay really, really cold. Otherwise, everything falls apart. Now finally, a tablespoon of vinegar. The acid in the vinegar just helps the pie crust stay extra tender. Now I'll just stir it around with a spoon until it just comes together. Now I'll just break the dough in half, and then I'll put each helping into its own plastic bag. I'll just form it into a rough ball. And then after I stick it in the bag, I just flatten it slightly, and that'll make it easier to roll out later. Okay, I'll get the second one in. This pie crust is so good without the spices, but it's particularly delicious with. All right, now I'm gonna stick the pie crust into the freezer. This crust is for a future pie, and this one just needs to chill for about 20 minutes. So when the time's up, all I have to do is get the dough out of the bag and onto a floured surface and start rolling. I just keep going until it's slightly larger than the pie pan. Then I roll it around the rolling pin, lift it onto the pie pan, carefully unroll it, and press it in. Then I tear off the excess dough and tuck the edge under neatly and go around pinching the dough to crimp it. I've just been slicing a bunch of peeled apples. I've got about 6 to 7 cups of apple slices in the bowl. And now I'll add a 1/2 cup of sugar. And then to make it a little bit thicker, I'll add a 1/4 cup of flour. To combat all that sweetness, it needs a little salt, about 1/4 teaspoon. And then I'll slice a lemon in half, and I'll just squeeze in the juice of 1/2 of it. That is all combined. Now I'll just bring up the beautiful crust, and I'll just pile the apples right in the crust. And when I say pile, I mean pile. I don't believe in having a level apple pie. Okay, just perfect. Now, there are many delicious things about this apple pie. and this crumb topping is one of them. It's butter and flour cut together with some brown sugar, quick oats, which give fabulous texture, and a little salt, all stirred together. Okay, now the crumb topping just gets sprinkled all over the pie. Use my hands. If some of it falls onto the floor, no problem. There's plenty more where that came from. Big pile. Now I'll just use my hands to let it fall into the cracks. Oh my gosh, look at that. Gorgeous. Now the pie goes into a 375-degree oven for about an hour. Then there's another thing to add to the topping before it finishes baking. Half a cup of chopped pecans. Delicious. Okay, back in for 5 more minutes. Well, my house smells heavenly, and that means the pie is ready to come out of the oven. It just looks amazing. Oh, nice and golden, those crunchy nuts on top. The crust looks gorgeous. Now to finish it off and to make it caramel apple pie, I'll just crack open a jar of caramel sauce and I'll just drizzle it all over the pie. My gosh, that looks so good. We're rolling up fence. It's the tougher, slightly less romantic side of ranching. And fence fixers definitely deserve a treat. Homemade glazed donuts fit that bill. Just pour 1 1/8 cup of warm milk into a bowl. Add half a cup of granulated sugar and 3 teaspoons of instant yeast. Then there are a couple more elements to whip up. Beat 2 large eggs in a bowl, then slowly mix in 1 1/4 cup of melted butter. Next comes the dry mix, 4 cups of all-purpose flour and a half a teaspoon of salt. Now the mixer does all the work. Add the butter and egg mixture to the bowl of an electric mixer, then pour the milk, yeast, and sugar mixture into the mixer. Add a half a cup of the dry mix at a time and allow it to slowly incorporate. After 5 minutes of mixing, transfer the dough to a lightly oiled bowl, cover it with plastic wrap, and refrigerate it for 8 to 12 hours. In the morning, remove the dough from the fridge and let it come to room temperature for about an hour or so. Then roll it out until it's about 1/4 inch thick and use a donut cutter to cut out the donuts. Then just cover them lightly with tea towels and let them rise for another 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So that's as far as I got before I realized I was out of shortening in my house. So that's why I'm driving down the road with a tray full of unfried donuts. I'm gonna get to frying the donuts. I found some vegetable shortening and I've got it heated in a pot to 350 degrees. Now I had plenty of vegetable oil at my house, but I've learned the hard way that you do not fry donuts in vegetable oil. For some reason they just absorb the oil and they become really heavy and clunky. It's really essential when you fry donuts to use a candy or oil thermometer so you can make sure the temperature stays at 350. If it gets too hot, the donuts will burn right away. If it's not hot enough, they'll just sort of fall flat. Now frying the donuts just takes about a minute, just about 30 to 45 seconds per side if the oil is 350. Okay, the first 4 are ready. I've got all the donuts fried and I'm just taking out the last of the donut holes. Smells so good. I'll let those sit for a minute and whip up the yummy glaze that goes on the donuts. I've got 3 cups of powdered sugar. I'm gonna add just about half a teaspoon of salt, half a teaspoon of vanilla, and half a cup of cold water. Very, very, very simple. The donuts don't need much. Okay, totally perfectly smooth. Now, I'll start by grabbing the donut holes and I'm gonna put them on a baking sheet under this wire rack. And I'll show you why in a minute. And glazing is really fun. I just drop them in one at a time, give them a little swirl, and just put them on the rack. And you can see they're dripping on the donut holes below. All right, got them all glazed. Now I can't forget about these lovely little babies down here. Now I'm just gonna let these set for a few minutes, then I'll pack them up and take them to the guys. I'm making blackberry cheesecake squares. Who doesn't love cheesecake? I'll start by making the cheesecake crust. I'm using a package of vanilla wafers for the cheesecake crust. A lot of times I use graham cracker crumbs, but there's just something about vanilla wafers. They're a little bit sweeter, a little bit more of a treat, and they make a delicious crust. I'm just adding about a half a cup of pecans. I love the flavor of the pecans and the vanilla wafers. Okay, then I'll just crush these up. Okay, that looks good. Now I'm gonna pulse the machine while I drizzle in a stick of melted butter. This will just help the crust come together. Okay, that's just right. Now I have a pan that I lined in foil and then sprayed the foil with nonstick baking spray. Now I'll just grab the crumbs and just pour them right in the pan. They smell so good. I could just grab a spoon right now and eat it as a snack. Okay, now I'll just use my hands to press it evenly all over the surface of the pan. The crust is all ready. Now I'll move on to the filling. And that's 3 8-ounce packages of cream cheese. They've been out for a little bit, so they're pretty soft. Usually when I make cheesecake, I make them in regular round springform pans. But for potluck, I always think that things should be in neat squares so when people go through the line, they can easily serve themselves. Okay, and then I'll add a cup and a half of sugar, cream cheese and sugar. What a combination. Okay, and then I'll just splash in about 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla. And then I'll just whip this till it's really fluffy. So I'm gonna crack in 4 eggs. Okay, just keep going. 3rd egg. Last egg. All right, now I have a package of sour cream. I'll add 4 ounces, otherwise known as half a cup. Just plop it right in there. That looks absolutely beautiful. Oh, so creamy and delicious. I get to lick the bowl, as usual. I definitely need a spatula. I don't want any of this to go to waste. Oh my goodness, who invented cheesecake? I think they should be sainted. All right, I just get all of that in there. Goodness gracious. One of the most beautiful sights in the world. Okay, I'll just spread it out so it's in a nice even layer on top. All right, now I'm just gonna bake this in a 350-degree oven for about 45 to 50 minutes. I topped the cheesecake with this beautiful blackberry topping. I'll tell you how I made it. So I threw a pile of plump, ripe blackberries into a pan with sugar and water. Then I brought it to a boil and simmered it for 4 or 5 minutes. Then, to thicken it slightly, I mixed up a slurry of cornstarch and water and stirred it into the blackberry mixture. Then I boiled it for another minute or so, and when it was cooled, I poured it over the cheesecake and popped it into the fridge to set. I'm hoping the foil will just lift the cheesecake right out, and it worked. I love it when that happens. And then I'll just cut it into really neat squares. I've got a really sharp serrated knife, and that makes it easy to slice through the blackberries on top. The other benefit to cutting the cheesecake into squares and putting it on a platter is that sometimes you can sneak a piece and no one will ever know. All right, all cut into squares. Now I'll just take the squares and get them on the platter. No-bake peanut butter bars are a cute, crunchy treat. They're so easy to make, and I love how there's no oven involved. Now, the bars have a nice chocolatey topping, and that's what I'll start on first. I've got 2 cups of semi-sweet chocolate chips in a double boiler, and I'll just add about 1/2 cup of creamy peanut butter. Now it's gonna take a few minutes for that to start to melt, so I'll move over to the cookie part. I'm just using regular vanilla wafers. I've got them in a big plastic bag, and I'm just using a rolling pin to break them up. These cookies will serve as the structure of the peanut butter bars, and I love that they just come straight out of the pantry. So that's looking good right there. Now I'll move on to the mixer, and I've got 2 sticks of salted butter. Now, butter is not a pantry item. The butter is sort of indispensable when it comes to making these bars delicious, so I'll forgive myself just this once. Now, into this mixture, I'm gonna add a cup of crunchy peanut butter. All right, that looks like about a cup. Now, I'll start mixing this together. Butter and peanut butter. What is the world coming to? Now, while that mixes together, I'll check on the topping. Things are looking good over here. Oh, the peanut butter's all melted and the chocolate is too. So I'll just stir it around until it's totally mixed together. All right, that is looking great. Now I'll take that off to cool a bit. Now back to the mixer. I'm gonna add a little sweetness to this. 2 cups of powdered sugar, and I've learned the hard way to add 1 cup at a time. Now I'll turn it on and let it mix. And then I'll add the 2nd cup. If powdered sugar flies everywhere, it doesn't matter. Nobody's watching. Now, while this is mixing together, I'll just pour in 2 cups of mini chocolate chips, and I'll give those a chance to mix in. And now in go the vanilla wafer crumbs. I add the crumbs at the very last. I don't want them to crush up and get too fine in the mixing process. Okay, that is all mixed together. I do not want to over-mix it and crush up all those crumbs. Now I have a 9 by 13 inch pan. I smeared it with butter, and I'll just get the paddle, get all that extra off. And then this just goes right into the buttered pan. Now I'm just using the spatula to press it into a single layer. Try to get the top as flat as I can. Doesn't have to be perfect, of course. Okay, I've got that into a single layer. It looks amazing. It's about to look more amazing. I've got this beautiful chocolatey, peanut buttery topping, and I'll just pour it all over the top of these bars. I'm speechless, literally. I have nothing to say. It just looks so good. I would like to swim in this bowl of chocolate topping. Scrape the extra in. Goodness gracious. Now I'll just use a spoon to spread it into a single layer, get all the way out to the edges. I want every single bar to be covered with this chocolate. I get to lick the bowl. Now I want to sprinkle some peanuts on top, so I'll give them a quick chop. I don't need too many. I'm going to chop them really fine. And this is where you could also have some fun. You could just do vanilla wafer crumbs on top if you don't want to do nuts, saltines, even crushed up pretzels. Wow. That should be good. I'll just grab them and sprinkle them over. These are so darn easy. I make them a lot, and I never can get over how simple they are to make. Now you can do just a light sprinkling of nuts, or you can do a really thick layer. I'm somewhere in between. Absolutely perfect. Now I've got to get these into the fridge to set. I'm going to put them in there for at least an hour, and then they'll be all ready to cut. I cannot believe this pan was made from only pantry ingredients. Well, and a little bit of butter. Okay, so after about an hour in the fridge, they were ready to cut into bars. 3 cuts lengthwise and 4 cuts across. Then I piled all 20 of them onto a cake stand, and let me tell you, they did not last long. The whole gang is over at my brother-in-law Tim's ranch working calves today. It is a huge morning of work, and the whole family is pitching in. Since they're gonna be working hard all morning, I'm gonna take them a big lunch. I'm gonna start by getting 2 dump cakes in the oven. I love dump cakes. They're an old recipe, always a crowd pleaser, and the ingredients are so easy. Now I'm gonna make 2 varieties of dump cake. The first one is cherry pineapple. So that starts with a big can of cherry pie filling, nice and bright red and sweet. and then a can of crushed pineapple. It's a little bit of an unusual combination, but this is a classic dump cake recipe, and it is so delicious after it bakes. Okay, I got that all mixed together and spread out evenly. So now I grabbed cake mix, another essential component to a dump cake. That's what makes it so easy. This is a white cake mix, and I'll just sprinkle it all over the surface of the fruit. You can use absolutely any kind of cake mix you want. I've used the cherry pie filling before with chocolate cake mix. Oh boy, is that good. Okay, now I'll just get it all covered, make sure there's no fruit showing, and now I'll move forward with the second variety, which is even simpler than the first. I've got a big can of sliced peaches in syrup, and the whole thing goes into the pan. It looks like a lot of liquid, and it is, but the cake pretty much absorbs it all. Now, for the cake mix for this one, I'm using yellow cake mix. There's absolutely no rhyme or reason to what kind of cake mix you use with the fruit. It's just a matter of what you have in your pantry. It's pretty much 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It still winds up delicious. All right, I'll make sure it's totally covered. Okay, now I'll just spread the cake mix around. Now, the thing that makes all of this make sense, I cut 3 sticks of cold butter into pieces, and I just lay the pieces of butter all over the surface of the cake mix. This is an incredibly decadent cake. I don't know if you've noticed that by now. There is nothing redeeming about it. The name is hilarious, the ingredients are simple, and I'm proud every time I make one. The great thing about dump cakes is they are so rich that a little goes a long way. And since I'm feeding a crowd today, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Okay, got all the butter on. I think that's probably enough butter. So I'll just get these in the oven. They need to bake at 350 degrees for about 45 minutes to an hour until they're nice and hot and bubbly and golden. All right, guys, when you're ready for dessert, I've got dump cake, 2 different kinds. Of course, he's first in line for dessert.
Todd, did you even eat any real food?
Yes, sir.
This is peach and this is cherry, pineapple.
Amazing.
And we need an adult supervision on the whipped cream.
Yeah,
Gosh.
adult supervision.